The night had fallen quietly over the farmhouse, the kind of stillness that comes after a day of steady work and familiar routine. The old man, 72 years behind him, eased himself from the kitchen table where his tea was cooling, muttered that he'd just shut the barn for the night, and pulled on his boots. His coat stayed on the peg by the door. His truck keys rested in their usual bowl. The phone was charging in its socket, a red glow in the corner. Nothing suggested he meant to go far or to be gone for long. He had only a short walk ahead, 50 yards through brittle grass to the barn doors that had been slid closed each night for decades. The family barely noticed him leave at first. His daughter rinsed dishes at the sink. His grandson shuffled through homework at the table. It was habit, a rhythm. He went out every evening, checked latches, tightened things, and came back with the smell of hay and oil clinging to his clothes. That night, the minutes ticked, and the sound of boots never returned to the porch. By the time the grandson looked up and asked, "Where's Grandpa?" The kitchen clock had run 20 minutes forward. His daughter wiped her hands and went to the door, expecting him to be right outside. The yard looked empty in the weak porch light. She called into the wind. No answer. The beam of a flashlight skimmed across the path, catching the silver of grass bent underfoot. It traced straight to the barn and then stopped. The doors were closed, heavy and quiet. When she slid one open, the air was the usual mix: diesel, hay, the faint sour of animals that hadn't been kept there in years. But there was no movement, no voice, no figure bent at a tool bench or fumbling for a switch. The beam cut across rafters, over piles of feed sacks, into corners where mice had chewed holes. Empty. By the time the sheriff's office was called, the wind had picked up and the night was thick. Deputies arrived, noted the car still in the driveway, the coat still on the peg. They took in the little details with the careful eye of people trained to look for departures from normal. A thermos half-filled on the counter, reading glasses on the chair arm, boots gone from their spot by the door. He had gone to the barn in work boots, not in anything meant for distance. A deputy knelt by the grass path, feeling for impressions with a gloved hand. The tracks led cleanly from house to barn, but didn't lead back. Inside the barn they searched, checked lofts, ran flashlights along the ground. They found a faint scrape near the east wall that they couldn't place. Maybe a tool dragged, maybe nothing. One deputy said he thought the latch on the interior door looked freshly scratched, like metal against metal. They logged it, but didn't press the point. The family followed every step, their worry sharpening into panic. His daughter insisted he had no reason to leave, no errands, no appointments. His grandson clung to the porch post, scanning the darkness as though the old man might be walking up the drive any second. Deputies spread out, checking fence lines and sheds. One walked down toward the pond with a light and came back shaking his head. The night was giving them nothing. They called for a K9 unit. By the time the dog arrived, the cold air had already shifted scents. The animal pulled hard to the barn doors, circled, then whined in confusion. The handler admitted the trail seemed to just stop. That made little sense. A man doesn't walk 50 yards and vanish like steam. They checked the pond again, dragging hooks across the surface while the family watched from the bank, shivering in their coats. The water gave up only weeds and mud. Back at the barn, deputies lingered longer than usual. Something about the stillness inside didn't fit. Everything was neat, tools hung in order, feed stacked. Nothing toppled, no signs of a struggle. But there was no clear way to explain how a man could walk in and not walk back out. They looked for trap doors, fresh sawdust, loose boards. The floor was solid dirt and concrete patches, old but unbroken. A bent nail near the wall was noted, though no one could say why it seemed odd. It was just one more detail among many that didn't add up. When dawn came, the search widened. Neighbors came over, combing fields and ditch lines. The sheriff stood by the barn, squinting into the sunrise, and admitted to the family that it was as though the man had simply been erased. That word, erased, stuck. It was easier than believing he had chosen to leave or that something violent had happened so close to home without anyone hearing. By evening the next day, flyers were being printed. The photo chosen showed him smiling, holding a grandchild on his knee. The words, "missing," sat bold above it. The family's hope was plain. He had gone wandering, gotten confused, maybe was hurt somewhere waiting to be found. But beneath that hope lay a truth no one wanted to voice yet. People don't disappear between a kitchen door and a barn without leaving something behind to explain it. The first 24 hours had ended with nothing but a locked door, a cold barn, and silence where a life should have been. The sheriff promised more deputies, more dogs, more eyes on the ground. But when the family stood in the kitchen that night, staring at the empty chair where he always sat with his tea, the weight of absence pressed in. It was not just a missing person now. It was the beginning of a mystery that had already taken root in the walls of the farmhouse, in the dirt path to the barn, and in the lives of everyone left behind. The first 48 hours were the hardest, but the days that followed stretched into something heavier, slower, almost unbearable. By the third morning after his disappearance, the barnyard was no longer quiet. It was a hive of movement, with uniformed deputies setting up command posts, neighbors showing up with thermoses of coffee, and volunteers being handed clipboards and instructions. The ground that had always belonged to one family now belonged to the search. K-9 units arrived from 2 counties over, their handlers leading them down property lines and along the banks of the pond. The dogs strained against leashes, noses pressed to the grass where his footprints had been only nights earlier. They followed the path to the barn again and again, circling with uncertainty, then whining when the trail simply ended. Handlers tried to pick up the scent elsewhere, along the hedgerows, by the ditch, across the gravel drive. But each time, it evaporated as if the man had vanished into the air. For the family, watching from the porch, the sound of the dogs' barks carried both hope and dread. If the dogs couldn't find him, what chance did they have? By the end of the first week, the search widened. Deputies mapped the fields into neat grids, stretching bright surveyor's tape across long rows of grass. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the ground, flags in their hands to mark anything out of place. Wallets, scraps of cloth, bone fragments, every discovery was called out, inspected, and almost always dismissed. Each false alarm felt like a fresh wound. The granddaughter described it later as walking through her own backyard and realizing it had become a crime scene. Ponds on neighboring properties were dragged by deputies and waders. The sound of metal hooks scraping across silt echoed in the summer heat. They pulled up weeds, branches, the occasional snapping turtle, but nothing human. A dive team was even brought in, their black suits slicing through the murky water, bubbles rising as if the pond itself were breathing secrets. When they surfaced empty-handed, the relief was brief. If he wasn't in the water, then where was he? The sheriff authorized the use of drones to cover the wide cornfields and tree lines. From above, the land looked orderly, neat squares and strips. But when the images were studied, nothing out of the ordinary appeared. The drones flew crooked patterns across the sky, tracing the same land again and again, producing only silence. Each new tool, each new tactic, ended with the same emptiness. Detectives went door to door, asking the same questions until the answers blurred. Did anyone see him leave the barn? Did anyone notice a strange vehicle in the area? Did he have enemies, debts, secret conflicts? The replies were always the same. No, no, no. He was a good man, private, dependable, not the kind who vanished willingly. No gambling, no affairs, no grudges that anyone wanted to admit. The ordinariness of the answers frustrated investigators. It is often the small cracks in a person's life that reveal where they might have gone. But here, there were none. Inside the sheriff's office, whiteboards filled with possible theories. One side argued he had wandered off, disoriented, maybe struck by sudden illness and collapsed. Somewhere hidden. Another pushed the theory of accident, that he had fallen into a well, a sinkhole, or had been struck by a passing vehicle. A third group leaned toward foul play, pointing to the fresh scratches on the barn latch and the missing crowbar. Each theory was pursued hard, but none fit completely. Each time they circled back, the case returned to the same impossible question. How does a man disappear between a kitchen door and a barn? The family clung to hope as summer rolled on. They sat through interviews, repeated the same details, tried to recall anything unusual about that night. But memory plays tricks under strain. Some swore the barn light was left on, others swore it wasn't. One thought they'd heard a truck backfiring down the road around the same time, but couldn't be sure. Each inconsistency only deepened the uncertainty. Volunteers combed culverts and windbreaks, pushing through thickets where snakes darted and mosquitoes swarmed. They searched drainage ditches along the highway, even abandoned farmsteads miles away. The search party dwindled with each week as the summer heat wore people down. By July, only a core group of deputies and neighbors remained. The granddaughter noticed the silence in the house growing thicker. The chair by the window stayed empty. His shoes stayed lined by the wall. His absence was everywhere and nowhere. By August, the search had shifted more toward paperwork than physical ground. Investigators compiled binders of interviews, lists of recovered items, photographs of nothing in particular. The case file swelled, even as the hope of finding him shrank. His daughter described the months as a blur of faces at the door, voices asking the same questions, then silence when they realized there were no answers left to give. The sheriff called a meeting with the family before the end of summer. He explained that resources were thinning, that without new leads the search could not continue at the same intensity. The words were heavy, bureaucratic, but the message was clear. They were running out of places to look. The family listened, numb, knowing what it meant. The official search might end, but their waiting would not. As the last heat of August settled over the farm, the barn stood as it always had, weathered and patient, a silent witness. The grass path between house and door had grown thin from the endless footsteps of searchers, yet it still held the same unanswered question. He had walked it once, and then he was gone. 11 years later, they would discover the truth. But for now, that summer left them only with empty fields, a thicker case file, and a family hollowed out by silence. The barn became the center of gravity for the investigation, the place where everything seemed to begin and abruptly end. Deputies returned to it again and again, sometimes with new tools, sometimes just with the same eyes, hoping to catch what they had missed the last time. To step inside was to breathe in the smell of oil soaked into wood, hay bales stacked in their usual order, dust hanging in beams of light. It was the smell of a life lived by routine, a man who knew exactly where his tools were and how every latch and hinge worked. Yet within that order lay a handful of things that made no sense. The first was absence. A crowbar that should have hung on its peg above the workbench was missing. It wasn't the kind of tool he lent out, nor the kind of item one would misplace easily. His grandson confirmed it had been there earlier that week when they patched a section of fencing together. The second was presence, a partial print in dried mud along the interior floor, its edges blurred, but wrong enough to draw attention. It was shaped like a boot, but the sole pattern was irregular, almost as if the tread had been filed down or worn unevenly. Crime scene photographers captured it from multiple angles, but comparison turned up nothing. The latch on the main door also carried its own question mark. Fresh scratches around the hasp suggested metal had been forced against it recently, though the door itself showed no sign of being broken open. Investigators wondered if someone had tried to tamper with it, or if the scratches came from years of use. The daughter insisted her father maintained his tools meticulously, even the barn doors. The idea that rough marks had suddenly appeared unsettled her, as if someone else had handled what had always been his. Crime scene technicians swept every surface they could, powdering beams and dusting rafters. They set up ultraviolet lights in the animal stalls, hoping to catch traces invisible to the eye, blood, fibers, anything. The results were underwhelming. They lifted fingerprints from a feed bin, but every one of them belonged to the missing man. None were foreign, none unexpected. In a sense, the barn felt almost too clean. A lifetime of use should have produced clutter, randomness, but what they found instead was order, except for the details that disturbed them. One deputy in particular couldn't stop focusing on a bent nail near the east wall. At first, it seemed trivial, just a nail driven at the wrong angle years ago, but the way it jutted from the wood, the way fresh scuff marks circled its edge, nagged at him. He crouched down, ran his gloved finger across it, tapped the wood nearby. To him, the sound wasn't quite right. He mentioned it to his superior, but without more, it was logged only as a note. In a case this thin, even the smallest oddities found their way into the report, though most were quickly forgotten. The barn was mapped in diagrams. Measurements were taken of the space, from the loft to the dirt-packed floor. The missing crowbar, the scratch marks, the single blurred print, all of it was written into the record, but none of it linked into a story investigators could stand behind. It was noise without music, pieces without pattern. Detectives rotated through shifts, each hoping a fresh perspective would reveal the thread, but the barn kept its silence. The family, meanwhile, found it unbearable to enter. His daughter said walking inside felt like trespassing. His grandson avoided even looking at it from the porch. Neighbors whispered about what had been found and what hadn't, theories ranging from secret visitors to the possibility of the old man staging his own disappearance. But for the family, the barn only deepened the wound. It was the last place he had been seen, yet it offered no explanation, only more questions. As the weeks passed, the barn became less a site of active search and more a monument to failure. Detectives still returned with new ideas, metal detectors across the floor, infrared scans of the walls, chemical tests on the soil, but none produced results that changed the direction of the case. Each time they left, they carried only thicker files and heavier doubt. Still, that bent nail remained in the notes, a detail that one deputy could not let go of. At the time, it was little more than a curiosity, a mark on a page. No one imagined it would one day point toward the hidden truth buried beneath the east wall. But in that first summer, the barn gave them nothing certain, only the unsettling knowledge that within its walls, something had happened that refused to reveal itself. And so, the investigation stalled in frustration. The barn, with all its smells of oil and hay and memory, stood unchanged. The missing crowbar, the strange print, the scratches, and that bent nail offered fragments, but no answer. For a family desperate to understand, for detectives grasping for leads, it became clear that the barn would not confess easily. Whatever it knew, it was keeping hidden, leaving only silence where they expected resolution. In the weeks after the searches slowed, the town began to fill the silence with its own explanations. At the diner, between cups of coffee poured into chipped mugs, neighbors spoke his name in lowered voices, as if it were fragile. Some said he had simply wandered off, the way older men sometimes did, forgetting where they were going. Others whispered about accidents too shameful to mention, farmers crushed by machinery, men drowned in wells, things families might want to keep hidden. Everyone seemed to have a theory, and most settled on whichever one allowed them to sleep easier. In small towns, certainty, even false certainty, is often kinder than the unknown. For his daughter and granddaughter, life refused to pause in sympathy. The mortgage still demanded its monthly payment, even as the house felt emptier with each passing night. Insurance forms sat on the kitchen table in stacks, their fine print impossible to understand, all asking for confirmation of death that no one could give. She needed his signature to release certain accounts, but his hand had been absent for too long. She described it later as living in two worlds at once, one where she begged for him to come walking back through the door, and another where she was forced to sign documents assuming he never would. The granddaughter, young but old enough to understand what absence meant, tried to help by boxing up feed receipts and old invoices from the barn. She avoided looking at the structure itself, its shadow stretching long across the yard each evening. To her, it was no longer a place of work or comfort, but the last known location of her grandfather. And standing near it felt like standing at the edge of something bottomless. She stacked papers, labeled boxes, tried to bring order to something that was anything but orderly. In the middle of this grief and confusion came the rumors. Two men approached the sheriff separately, each carrying their own story that they swore would break the case open. The first claimed he had seen a stranger's truck idling along the road by the farm the night the old man vanished. He described its color, its dents, even a license plate he admitted he might have imagined. Deputies followed up, tracing every truck that remotely fit, but none connected. The second man insisted the farmer owed him money, a debt unpaid from years back. He told the story loudly to anyone who would listen, making himself sound like both victim and informant. But when pressed, the details shifted and thinned until nothing credible remained. In the end, both leads went the way so many did, into the file, stamped and shelved. The sheriff's office kept logging hours. Deputies spent evenings retracing old paths, driving the same roads at different times of night, running down every call that came in from the public. Each tip, no matter how thin, was followed until it fell apart. Their notes reflected a kind of exhaustion. No evidence, no match, inconclusive. On the surface, it was persistence, but underneath, it was the slow erosion of hope. Even professionals feel the weight when answers never come. Meanwhile, the family bore the quieter burdens. The daughter found herself explaining to bill collectors why checks were late, why paperwork was missing, why she couldn't sign her father's name on documents. She tried to run the farm with what little help she had, selling off livestock in small groups just to keep afloat. Every decision carried guilt. Each sale felt like dismantling the life her father had built piece by piece. Neighbors dropped off casseroles in the first weeks, then fewer as time passed. Concern turned into avoidance. Some people found it easier not to stop by at all, as though disappearance might be contagious. The family learned to live with the looks at church, the way conversations paused when they walked into a room. It was the town's way of saying they didn't know what to make of it either. By late fall, the case had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The sheriff would call every few days with updates that amounted to little more than, "We're still working on it." The family nodded, thanked him, and went back to the grind of survival. Nights stretched longer, the barn loomed darker, and still nothing shifted. But within the sheriff's office, a few deputies kept circling back to the details no one could quite explain. The missing crowbar, the scratches on the latch, the bent nail by the east wall. They didn't add up to much, but they didn't fade either. Even as the paperwork grew, even as the leads dried up, those details lingered like questions whispered in a locked room. For now, though, the weight of everyday life pressed hardest. And in a town that prized good reputations and ordinary routines, the image of a good man who had simply vanished was easier to live with than the darker truths no one wanted to name. The case had already begun to sink into routine, leads rising, collapsing, then fading into silence, when a younger detective, newly transferred into the county, pulled the grandfather's file off the shelf. He was fresh enough to see what others had stopped noticing, restless enough to connect dots no one else thought worth connecting. Flipping through years of reports, he paused when he saw a name that didn't fit the timeline of disappearance, but carried weight from another chapter of tragedy. It was a case number from 1994, attached to a single sentence in the margin. Victim's father present at scene. The victim was the farmer's only daughter. She had been murdered on a roadside less than 2 miles from where the farmhouse stood. That earlier crime had never been solved. She had been found in her car, headlights still glowing against the ditch grass, her body showing signs of blunt force trauma. The sheriff's office at the time had no shortage of suspects, boyfriends, drifters, men who drank too much and talked too loosely, but no charges were ever filed. Among those names, one stood out: Cal Weller. He was a transient who had been seen in the area, questioned, and then slipped away before a warrant could catch him. The notes in the old file spoke of him like a ghost, always one step beyond the law, moving from county to county, never staying long enough to pin down. For the family, the memory of that night in 1994 had never healed. They didn't talk about it openly, but anyone who visited the house knew her absence lived in the walls. Her photograph remained in the living room, her smile frozen in a frame that grew dustier with time. When her father disappeared years later, some in the family quietly wondered if the two events could somehow be linked, though no one dared say it aloud. The suggestion was too heavy, too cruel. 2 blows dealt to the same family, both without resolution. The detective began comparing the 2 cases. He noticed similarities that unsettled him: the lack of struggle at the scenes, the abruptness with which each victim's life had been cut short, the vanishing of potential suspects into thin air. He brought these questions to his colleagues, but most dismissed them. They argued that one case belonged to the past, nearly 2 decades cold, while the other was fresh and consuming their resources. Still, he wrote memos, flagged connections, and quietly started asking around about the drifter named Cal Weller. In town, the mention of Weller stirred unease. Older residents remembered him as the kind of man who loitered on back roads, offering to fix fences or haul junk for cash. He was described as both forgettable and dangerous, a man who seemed ordinary until you noticed the way he lingered too long near young women, or the way he never gave the same story twice. Some swore he left after the daughter's death. Others claimed they saw him in nearby counties years later. No one had proof, only stories that shifted with time. The granddaughter, by then a teenager, overheard enough whispers to know this man's name was tied to her family's grief. She asked her mother about it, but the reply was curt, almost bitter. "That's not something we talk about." For her, the silence became its own burden. She wondered whether her grandfather had lived with that knowledge every day, whether the weight of losing his daughter and never seeing justice had carved something unspoken into him. Detectives revisited the daughter's case files, examining evidence that had grown brittle with age. Photographs faded, chain of custody forms yellowed, but the pain in the details was still sharp. They found that Weller's fingerprints had never been matched, his DNA never collected, his whereabouts after 1995 largely unknown. The younger detective argued that the grandfather might have known more than he let on, that his disappearance could not be separated from the earlier tragedy. Others warned against building theories on ghosts. Still, the connection lingered. The granddaughter would later recall standing in the barn one evening, staring at the empty workbench, and feeling as though her grandfather had been carrying secrets none of them had been strong enough to name. Secrets that reached back decades to a roadside crime that had fractured the family once before. The sheriff's office didn't pursue the lead aggressively at the time. With no fresh evidence, no confirmed sightings of Weller, and no clear link beyond circumstance, the theory was filed as context. But context has a way of reshaping how a case is seen. From then on, every unexplained detail, the missing crowbar, the scratches on the latch, the bent nail in the east wall, carried the shadow of that older crime. The family, though never told outright, sensed the shift. They felt the investigators circling closer to old wounds, reopening things they had spent years trying to bury. For the daughter, it was almost too much, losing her father on top of the daughter she had buried years earlier. For the granddaughter, it became a gnawing question. Had her grandfather's disappearance been random, or had it been bound to the unresolved violence that had haunted them since 1994? The town, true to form, adjusted the story to its own liking. Some whispered that maybe the farmer had finally gone searching for the man who had destroyed his family years earlier. Others believed Weller had come back, finished what he started. Neither theory had proof, but both offered explanation, and that was enough to keep the gossip alive. What no one could have known then was that the truth was not drifting outside the farm, but buried beneath it. The case from 1994 had left more than grief. It had left a mark that the grandfather carried with him into every corner of his life. And in time, investigators would learn that his disappearance wasn't the beginning of a mystery at all, but the end of something that had started decades earlier on that lonely roadside. The years that followed stretched out like a season that never seemed to end. After the last official search was scaled back, the farm settled into a strange rhythm of waiting. Each morning the daughter woke expecting the phone to ring, half believing some deputy would call with news that he had been found alive somewhere, disoriented, but safe. Each night, that hope collapsed under the silence. Days turned into weeks, then into months, until the first winter came and went without him. The farm carried on because it had to. Fields still needed tending, bills still arrived, and animals required care. But the absence of the man who had been its anchor was felt in every corner. The barn stood untouched for months, its doors rarely opened, its shadow stretching longer with each setting sun. His daughter described the place as hollow, saying it felt less like a building and more like a reminder carved into wood and steel. She moved through chores with mechanical precision, while her daughter grew older under the weight of grief that never seemed to ease. Time did what it always does to unsolved cases. It dulled the urgency. Detectives rotated out, new ones took their place, and the grandfather's file was re-tabbed, shifted to new hands, and reviewed less frequently with each passing year. Leads dried up, tips grew cold, and eventually even the sheriff's office could only offer occasional calls to say they were still watching, still waiting for something new. The granddaughter remembered the sound of her mother hanging up after those calls, always quiet, always with the same resigned look. Seasons passed, each one marked by the small erosions of life without him. The tractor sat longer in the shed without his hands to maintain it. The fields shrank as more acreage was sold off to pay taxes and keep the bank from seizing the land. Family gatherings grew thinner, conversation less animated. Grief became less a wound and more a condition, something they lived with every day without comment. The town, too, adjusted. For the first year or two, people still asked, still speculated, but as the seasons turned, his name was spoken less often. Some assumed he had wandered too far and died in the woods. Others thought he had been taken, his body hidden where no one would ever stumble across it. Most simply stopped asking. In a place where people valued routine, an unresolved disappearance became uncomfortable to dwell on. It was easier to let the mystery fade into background. For the granddaughter, the silence became its own inheritance. She grew from a child into a young woman, carrying the memory of a grandfather who had walked out one night and never returned. She avoided the barn, still uneasy with the knowledge that it was the last place he had been. Even when repairs were needed, she hesitated to go inside, her hands trembling at the latch. The air inside felt heavy, like it belonged to something unfinished. By the 5th year, the house itself bore the strain. Paint peeled from the siding, shingles slipped loose in storms, and repairs lagged. Her mother worked extra jobs trying to keep afloat, but the property seemed determined to collapse under its own weight. Neighbors helped when they could, but help came less often as the years passed. What remained was resilience stitched together by exhaustion. When the 11th year arrived, it felt less like an anniversary and more like a reckoning. The farm had aged visibly, the barn sagging at its foundation, boards warping and splitting under weather and neglect. When a county grant became available for rural stabilization projects, it was offered as a lifeline. A contractor was hired to make repairs, to keep the barn from folding in on itself. The family signed the papers reluctantly, as if giving permission to disturb a place that still held too many questions. The contractor walked the length of the barn, noting where beams needed reinforcement and siding required replacement. To him, it was just another job, but for the family, the work stirred something deeper. The barn was no longer just a building. It had become a kind of monument, holding their grief in silence. The idea of anyone pulling up boards, driving new nails, or disturbing the soil beneath it unsettled them in ways they couldn't fully explain. Still, they let the work begin. No one expected the barn to speak after so many years. They had learned to live with its silence, to bury their unanswered questions under routine. But as the first boards were lifted and the earth was tested for stability, small anomalies began to appear. A carpenter noted odd joins where old beams met new screws, as if someone had altered the structure years ago. Measurements didn't align perfectly. Sections of wall seemed slightly out of place. It was subtle, barely worth noticing. But for a family that had spent more than a decade haunted by absence, even subtle things carried weight. What had been 11 years of waiting was about to shift. The farm, the barn, and the silence that had defined them for so long would soon give up what they had been, hiding. For now, though, the family stood in the yard, watching contractors move in and out of the building, unaware that beneath the east wall lay the answer to a mystery that had stolen 11 winters of their lives. The carpenter assigned to the barn arrived with the kind of practical eye that comes from years of repairing weather-beaten structures. To him, the job was straightforward: reinforce the sagging beams, replace what rot had claimed, and stabilize the east wall before another storm season pushed it past repair. But almost immediately, small details began to unsettle him. The barn had been built decades earlier, with thick old-growth lumber cut by hand, yet certain boards along the east wall bore newer screws and brackets, the kind you could buy at a hardware store only in recent years. It was an odd marriage of eras, as though someone had patched the wall with unnecessary care, hiding something rather than fixing it. He tapped the planks with his hammer as he worked, listening for the tone that solid wood should make. Most of the barn replied with the expected dull thud, but when he reached a particular stretch near the ground, the sound changed. It was hollow, faintly resonant, like striking a drum. He crouched down, placed his ear close, and tapped again. The echo confirmed it. Something beneath the surface wasn't what it should be. He called another worker over, and together they pried back a section of board. Behind it, dirt should have pressed flush against the wall. Instead, there was space. Curiosity turned to unease. The carpenter documented the finding and notified the county inspector, who insisted on further testing before anything more invasive was done. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in, a formality meant to confirm whether the soil under the barn had shifted or if the foundation was unstable. But when the equipment passed over the east wall, the screen showed more than uneven earth. It traced a rectangular outline, sharply defined, far too precise to be natural. Inspectors studied the shape, arguing quietly among themselves. The dimensions were unusual, neither small enough to be a simple crawl space nor large enough to resemble a full basement. The family, standing nearby, listened as terms like void and substructure were used, words that meant little to them except that something man-made had been concealed under their barn all this time. For years they had avoided the place because of grief. Now, grief was joined by fear. The sheriff's office was called back in. Deputies arrived with measuring tape, clipboards, and expressions that betrayed more curiosity than comfort. They compared the carpenter's notes with the old case files, re-examining the bent nail that one deputy had flagged more than a decade earlier. What had seemed like a trivial observation back then now aligned with this discovery, the nail marking almost the exact spot where the hollow tone had been found. The family was asked to sign paperwork granting permission for a controlled excavation. It felt like signing away a piece of history. The daughter's hand shook as she wrote her name, the pen slipping once across the line. She admitted later that in that moment, she feared the barn would no longer just represent her father's disappearance. It might hold the answer to it. Contractors began the careful work of lifting boards and breaking through the hardened soil. Each strike of the tool into earth carried a kind of anticipation, a weight that everyone around could feel. Dust rose, tools clanged, and slowly a section of concrete revealed itself beneath the dirt, not rough, not improvised, but poured and smoothed deliberately, as though designed to last. In the following hours, the outline of a hatch appeared. It was fitted with steel, the kind meant to endure pressure from above, its edges sealed tightly against intrusion. The lock was rusted but unmistakable, a mechanism built to open from one side only. Investigators exchanged looks heavy with unspoken thoughts. Whatever this was, it wasn't an ordinary repair. It was deliberate, concealed, and built with purpose. The granddaughter stood back from the commotion, her arms wrapped around herself. She had been a child when her grandfather vanished. Now, as a young woman, she was watching the barn that had defined her grief begin to unravel its secrets. She felt a mix of fear and obligation, knowing that behind the hatch might lie the truth they had been denied for more than a decade. The truth could be unbearable, but ignorance had been no kinder. When the sheriff finally authorized the opening, it was done with caution. Tools were prepared, lights readied, cameras set to document. The family was told they didn't need to stay, but none of them left. They had lived with silence too long. Whatever was hidden beneath the east wall had waited 11 years to be found, and they would not turn away now. As the lock gave its first groaning protest under the pressure of crowbars, a silence fell across the yard. Everyone present understood what it meant. After years of questions, of rumors, of false starts, the barn was no longer just a backdrop to their grief. It was about to speak, and whatever lay below would change the story forever. The hatch finally gave way with a reluctant groan, the sound of rusted metal tearing free after years of silence. Deputies pulled it open, and a chill of air escaped, colder than the summer evening around them, stale and metallic. For a long moment, no one moved. The opening was dark, deeper than a crawl space, wider than anyone expected. Flashlights were lowered inside, beams slicing across concrete walls that looked unnaturally smooth, poured with intent. The barn had always seemed ordinary, patched and weathered by time, but beneath it was something else entirely, a secret room that had been deliberately hidden. Deputies descended first, their boots echoing on a steel ladder that led down into the earth. The space was bigger than a cellar, but smaller than a basement, a rectangle sunk into the ground with no windows, no natural light. The air was heavy with the scent of old oil and rust, thick with a silence that pressed into ears. As the flashlight swept across the room, the details emerged. Against one wall was a narrow cot, its thin mattress yellowed with age. Beside it sat a small generator, its casing dusty, the fuel cap sealed with layers of brittle tape. Jars of water lined a shelf, their contents cloudy, forgotten. A bucket stood in the corner, its purpose grimly obvious. But what froze everyone was the chain. It was bolted into the concrete floor, its length ending in a rusted cuff that still clasped bone. The remains of a human body lay slumped against the wall, collapsed inward by time. A femur angled across the floor, a rib cage brittle under the beam of light. The cuff around the wrist remained locked, as though holding a prisoner long after life had gone. Gasps rose from the deputies, but no one spoke. The silence seemed to demand it. Evidence techs moved cautiously, documenting every inch. They noted the way the generator had been positioned near a vent, the careful but crude effort to keep air circulating. They cataloged the jars, the bedding, the traces of clothing still clinging to the remains. Forensic specialists marked it as an improvised holding cell, an underground chamber designed for one purpose only: to confine. The family stood outside the barn, watching deputies emerge, pale-faced and shaken. They were told only fragments at first. There was a hidden room. There were remains. It would take time to identify who. The daughter gripped her chest as though to keep her heart from tearing out, the granddaughter silent, unable to process the words. 11 years of uncertainty had been unbearable, but now the possibility of an answer brought a different kind of fear. Whose bones lay beneath their barn? Investigators worked through the night. They collected samples from the remains, photographed the chamber, and debated quietly among themselves what they were seeing. It wasn't just a hidden cellar. It was a prison, carefully constructed, concealed, and maintained for reasons no one could yet explain. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this place secret, and someone had died inside it. The next day, the discovery hit the town like lightning. Neighbors gathered at fences, whispering theories. Some believed the bones belonged to the missing farmer, that his own barn had become his tomb. Others speculated darker stories, that he had been keeping someone there, someone from his past, and the secret had finally swallowed him too. The sheriff refused to answer questions until forensic testing could provide certainty, but his eyes betrayed the weight of what they had uncovered. Back at the farm, the family sat in stunned quiet. The granddaughter later admitted she couldn't stop, picturing the cot, the chain, the body slumped in its corner. She wondered if her grandfather had known it was there all along, or if he had stumbled onto it the night he disappeared. Each possibility was worse than the last. For her mother, the discovery reopened old grief. The unsolved murder of her sister decades earlier, the pain that had never healed. Now it seemed the past had found its way back, forcing itself out of the ground where it had been buried. The barn, once a place of ordinary routine, was now cordoned off by yellow tape. What it had concealed for more than a decade was no longer hidden. Beneath its east wall was not just a cellar, but a crime scene, one that carried with it the weight of years of silence. The sheriff gave a statement to the family before leaving that night. He told them gently but firmly that this discovery was only the beginning, not the end. Identifying the remains would take time. Understanding why such a place existed and how it tied to the disappearance of their father would take even longer. He promised answers, but they would come slowly, painfully, through the same kind of waiting they had endured for years. And as the family looked out across the fields that had sustained them for generations, the barn stood against the horizon, silent as ever. It had kept its secret for 11 years, and in truth, for far longer. Now that the secret had surfaced, it was clear the mystery had only deepened. What lay beneath the barn was not closure, but the beginning of a revelation that would unravel everything they thought they knew about the man they had lost. The cellar beneath the barn had already turned the investigation upside down, but as forensic teams combed through the concrete chamber, they found that the bones were only part of what had been hidden there. In a false panel behind a shelf of mason jars, one deputy discovered an old coffee can sealed with duct tape. Inside, packed tight, were items that would darken the story further. The first was a bundle of microcassette tapes, each labeled by month and year in a steady, square hand. Some dated back nearly 2 decades, others more recent, but all carried the same meticulous handwriting. Alongside them sat a ledger, its pages stiff but intact, filled with neat rows of dates, times, and brief notes. At the very bottom of the can were Polaroid photographs, grainy, washed in harsh flash, showing a bruised face staring blankly at the lens. The discovery stunned investigators. The cellar was no longer simply a hidden room with a body. It was a record, a log of someone's captivity. The tapes were rushed to the lab, and the first few were played that night. Static and hiss filled the speakers before a man's voice broke through, calm, deliberate, listing what sounded like warnings, punishments, even confessions. On several tapes, the same name surfaced, Cal Weller, the drifter from 1994, the man long suspected in the unsolved murder of the farmers. Daughter was heard describing attacks in chilling detail. He spoke of fear in voices not his own, described things only the killer could have known, and laughed quietly at his own recollections. DNA testing on a molar taken from the skeleton confirmed what the tape suggested. A match came back through CODIS, connecting the remains to a distant relative of Weller's who had once been arrested in another state. After years of speculation, the name that had haunted the family finally had evidence behind it. The bones chained to the floor of the hidden cellar belonged to Cal Weller. The man who had slipped away after the daughter's murder had not left the county at all. He had been here, beneath the barn, for years. But the ledger raised even darker questions. Page after page contained notes written in the farmer's careful handwriting. Times were recorded, food and water tallies marked, and warnings scribbled in the margins. No light today. Noise from vent too loud. Watch the fumes. The language was cold, mechanical, more like inventory than compassion. But what chilled investigators most was the pronoun "e" that appeared repeatedly, never spelled out, always referenced as though the writer and the subject shared an understanding. The Polaroids provided further confirmation. They showed Weller in various states, face swollen, eyes bloodshot, sometimes sitting on the cot, sometimes standing against the chain. Each image was dated, and together they spanned years. What they documented was not a single night of violence, but a long-term captivity, orchestrated and hidden by someone who had lived above ground as though nothing had changed. For the sheriff's office, the implications were staggering. If the farmer had been the one keeping these records, if he had built this chamber and locked Weller inside, then his disappearance was no longer the puzzle of a man erased. It was the story of a man who had become jailer and judge in secret. Some investigators speculated that the farmer had discovered Weller's involvement in his daughter's death years earlier and had chosen not to trust the courts. Others wondered if the sheriff's department back in the 90s had known more than they admitted, if someone had quietly allowed justice to be taken into private hands. The family, meanwhile, reeled under the weight of what was revealed. For the granddaughter, the man she had remembered as gentle and dependable was now painted in shadows she could not reconcile. Had her grandfather really been capable of building a prison under his barn? Had he spent years caring for crops and cattle by day and feeding his daughter's killer by night? The tape suggested he had. The ledger confirmed the pattern, but the knowledge sat like a stone in her chest. She wanted to believe he had acted out of love for his murdered child, yet the cold efficiency of the notes unsettled her. Deputies packed the coffee can evidence into boxes, cataloging each item with gloves and masks, but the weight of what they carried was more than physical. They were moving not just objects, but an entire hidden history, one that explained decades of silence. The cellar had spoken, and what it revealed was not a stranger's crime scene, but a secret courtroom buried beneath a barn. As the tapes played on, investigators heard Weller describing 3 separate attacks, each detail aligning with unsolved assaults from neighboring counties in the early 90s. The ledger marked dates that matched missing person reports long forgotten. Piece by piece, the story became undeniable. The farmer had not only identified his daughter's killer, but had captured him, kept him alive, and forced him into years of confinement. Yet the final question remained: what had happened the night the farmer himself vanished? The ledger ended abruptly, the last page smeared and water-stained. Its final entry, written in that same patient hand, read only, "Generator failing. Watch vent." It was a warning, maybe to himself, maybe to whoever might one day find the cellar. It was also a hint that the secret kept beneath the barn was on the edge of collapse. For investigators, the case was no longer about a disappearance alone. It had become a story of justice twisted into something darker, of grief that had turned into obsession, and of a man who had lived a double life until the very structure he had built betrayed him. What remained was to confirm the second set of remains, to see whether the missing farmer had truly died in the very chamber he had created. The forensic team worked for days inside the cellar, mapping stains on the concrete, cataloging air vents, and tracing the lines of exhaust residue that clung to the walls. Slowly, a picture formed of what had happened on the night the grandfather disappeared. The small generator, positioned near a vent designed to carry fumes outside, showed signs of long use, but the tape that had once sealed the cap was brittle and broken, the vent itself clogged with debris and soil. Carbon traces painted the walls, showing how the air had recirculated inside the chamber instead of escaping. The conclusion was grimly simple. When the machine failed, the room became a trap. 2 skeletons lay within its walls, each telling part of the story. One was already known: Cal Weller, the drifter suspected in the 1994 murder of the farmer's daughter. The other, smaller and more intact, bore the familiar wear of age: arthritic joints, healed fractures, dental records that matched perfectly to the missing grandfather. After 11 years, the question of where he had gone was finally answered. He hadn't vanished into the fields or wandered away into the woods. He had died beneath his own barn, alongside the man he had kept chained for years. The final pages of the ledger filled in the gaps. Written in the farmer's neat, deliberate script, they described the failing generator, his attempts to repair it, and his fear that the fumes were seeping back inside. "Vent blocked," one note read. "Try again tomorrow." Another, shakier than the rest, simply said, "No court would take him. I built one." Those words carried the weight of his entire hidden life. He had turned his grief into judgment, his barn into a prison, and himself into executioner and jailer. Investigators pieced together the timeline. Sometime after capturing Weller, whether through planning or chance, they believed the farmer had constructed the cellar in secret, pouring concrete with meticulous care, installing the generator, and ensuring no one else ever knew. For years he lived a double life. By day he was the dependable man neighbors trusted, a quiet farmer who paid his bills and minded his land. By night he descended into the earth to feed and monitor the man who had destroyed his family decades earlier. He documented everything in the ledger, not as confessions, but as records, as though keeping order justified the enormity of what he was doing. The sheriff, reading through the evidence, admitted privately that the farmer had done what the law never could. Weller had eluded justice for years, his name slipping through case files like smoke. Now the proof of his guilt lay in DNA, in tapes, in Polaroids that no courtroom could dispute. Yet justice had not come through trial or sentence. It had come through captivity, through a punishment hidden from the world until it collapsed under its own weight. For the family, The revelation was devastating in ways they hadn't expected. On one hand, they finally had answers. Their father hadn't simply disappeared without trace, hadn't abandoned them or lost his way. He had died on his land, still carrying the fight for his daughter's memory. On the other, they were forced to reckon with the truth that he had spent years hiding a secret darker than any of them could have imagined. The granddaughter struggled most, torn between admiration for the man who had avenged her aunt and horror at the thought of him keeping another human being chained beneath their farm. The community responded with unease. Some called him a hero, a man who had done what the law could not. Others condemned him, insisting that even monsters deserved courts, not cages. But for most, the story became a cautionary tale whispered in low tones. Grief can twist even the most ordinary lives into something unrecognizable. The sheriff's office closed 2 cases that had haunted the county for decades: the murder of the farmer's daughter in 1994 and the disappearance of the farmer himself 11 years later. But the files were closed with more weight than relief. Investigators admitted it was rare to find a resolution that explained so much and yet left so many uncomfortable truths behind. When the barn was finally torn down, the family stood at a distance. They couldn't watch the boards fall without remembering what lay beneath them. To them, the barn would never again be a place of work or routine. It had become a monument to grief, to secrets, and to the heavy burden of justice taken into one man's hands. In the end, the truth was not just that the grandfather had disappeared. It was that he had carried his pain into the earth and built walls around it, determined to finish what the courts never could. The cellar kept his secret until it couldn't anymore, until the failing vent forced the truth to rise back to the surface. 11 years of silence ended, not with a man returning, but with the revelation of what he had been hiding all along.